They say there is a man in Ashford City whose name even the police dare not speak. But that night, that man stood in the middle of a deserted industrial district, staring at his dead car engine, and for the first time in his life had no idea what to do. Nico Valenti stepped out of the car, eyes on his watch. 25 minutes. Exactly 25 minutes, until his meeting with Carmine Farrow, a meeting where his absence would be taken as a declaration of war. The driver popped the hood and shook his head. Frankie Nico's right hand pulled out his phone and called their support team. 45 minutes, boss. Backup car? Stuck in traffic. 30 minutes. Nico said nothing, but his jaw clenched tight. In this world, showing up late was not poor manners, it was weakness, and weakness in front of Farrow meant blood. A few dozen meters away, a beat-up van sat in an empty lot. The door swung open. A girl stepped out, torn jeans, a faded jacket, hair pulled up in a messy knot, grease stains etched deep into the skin of both hands. She walked straight toward the smoking luxury car. Fuel pump failure. Her voice was flat, calm, like she was commenting on the weather. I can fix it. Frankie blocked her path instantly, one hand raised. Walk away. Nico looked her over from head to toe. Worn-down shoes, a fraying backpack, engine grease on her wrists. This girl looked like she could not afford dinner, and she was offering to fix the car of the most powerful man in Ashford City. He turned away, did not even bother to respond. She did not repeat herself either. She just stood there, arms crossed, watching three men in suits fumble with the open hood like they had never seen an engine before. Minute 18 passed. The car was still dead. No backup in sight. Frankie called again, still stuck. Minute 20. Nico checked his watch. 5 minutes left. If he did not leave now, the meeting would collapse. And when the meeting collapsed, it would not just be money that was lost. He turned back. The girl was still standing there. Not begging, not pleading, not performing, just waiting. How long? Nico asked, clipped. 10 minutes. Maybe less. Nico glanced at Frankie. Frankie gave a slight shake of his head, meaning don't trust her. But Nico had no options left. Do it. The girl did not say another word. She opened her backpack. Inside was a set of old tools, a few worn-out wrenches, a pair of pliers, a coil of copper wire. This was the only thing her father had left behind, the only thing her ex-husband had not bothered to take because he thought it was worthless. He never knew it was the most valuable thing she owned. She leaned into the engine, hands moving fast and precise, every motion clean, nothing wasted, like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The driver stood beside her, wide-eyed. Frankie kept his arms crossed, face still skeptical. Nico stood still, watching. He had met hundreds of people in his life, flatterers, cowards, people who wanted him dead, people who wanted to use him, but no one had ever stood before him with this kind of calm. No fear, no attempt to impress. Simply she knew the work, and she did the work. 8 minutes. She straightened up, wiped her hands on her jeans. Start it. The driver got in, turned the key. The engine roared to life, smooth, alive, as if nothing had ever been wrong. Frankie looked at Nico. His eyes said, "Are you serious?" Nico was not looking at Frankie. He was looking at the girl. He pulled out his wallet and took out a thick stack of bills, more than most people earned in a week. He held it out to her. She looked at the money, then looked straight into Nico's eyes. Not defiance, not arrogance, just the gaze of someone who had been priced by money too many times and refused to let anyone do it again. I am not a beggar. You needed a fix. I knew how to fix it. We are done. She turned and walked back toward the van. Not fast, not slow. Nico stood there, his hand still holding the cash in midair. In over 10 years of running the Valenti empire, from debtors who knelt and begged, to rival bosses who weighed every word, no one had ever refused his money. No one, ever. Boss. Frankie opened the car door. We are late. Nico got in. But as the car pulled away, his eyes went to the rearview mirror. The van grew smaller in the darkness. The person who had just saved his $1 million meeting did not even have a roof over her head. Nico turned forward, but something had lodged itself in the mind of the Valenti boss, something that, for the first time in a very long time, he could not shake off. And he did not know that this girl, with her father's old toolkit and grease-stained hands, would change his entire life. If this story touched your heart, hit like and share it so this message can reach more people. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story that moves you. The meeting with Carmine Farrow that evening ended exactly the way Nico wanted it to. He arrived on time, sat down at the table with a face so calm it didn't show a single ripple, and Farrow gave up 3% of the Eastern Territory before he could even understand why he'd agreed so quickly. Frankie drove back in silence, glancing now and then at his boss through the rearview mirror. Nico sat in the back seat, his eyes turned toward the window, but he wasn't looking at the road. He was thinking about grease-stained hands and the words, "I don't beg," spoken by a girl whose name he didn't even know yet. The next morning, Nico called Frankie into the office inside the restaurant. "The girl from last night. Find her for me." Frankie didn't ask why. After 15 years beside his boss, he knew when to ask and when to do as he was told. 2 days later, Frankie placed a thin folder on Nico's desk. Tessa Whitfield, 27 years old. No fixed address. She lives in an old van, parked around empty lots in the industrial district. She has a 4-year-old son named Benji, and during the day she leaves him with a neighborhood woman she knows in a low-rent apartment complex on the south side of the city. Nico turned the page. Frankie continued. Her father was Walt Whitfield, a mechanic who once owned a small garage out in the suburbs. He died of illness when she was 19 and left behind a pile of medical debt. She married a man named Craig Whitfield about 2 years later. This Craig tricked her into signing over every piece of property during the divorce, then disappeared. The house was gone. The car was gone. The accounts were empty. She ended up on the street with a son who wasn't even 2 yet. Nico looked at the folder and said nothing. Right now, she does mobile repair work for small shops in the area. Whoever calls, she shows up. She finishes the job, takes the money, and makes just enough to buy milk and food for the boy from one day to the next. Frankie paused, then added, "Her skill is real, boss. Those small shops all call her when they're stuck. One shop owner said she can fix problems that mechanics with 10 years of experience can't even find." Nico closed the folder. He sat still for a long while, his finger tapping lightly against the surface of the desk, the habit he had whenever he was calculating something. 3 days later, a black car stopped in front of a small repair shop on the corner of 12th Street. The place had only 2 service bays, a low sheet metal roof, and a ceiling fan turning with a tired, uneven groan. Tessa was lying beneath an old pickup when she heard footsteps. She slid out, lifted her head, and immediately recognized the man standing in front of her. The man from that night. The man whose money she'd refused to take. Nico wasn't wearing a suit this time. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and he had no tie on. But the way he stood, the way he looked at her, was still the way a man stood when he was used to an entire room falling silent the moment he entered. "My garage needs a good mechanic," Nico said, without circling around it. "Steady pay. Paid on time. There's a room behind the garage for someone with family." Tessa stood, wiping her hands on a torn rag. She looked at Nico without blinking. "You found me fast. I can find anyone I want to find. And what do you want?" "I want a mechanic who knows what she's doing. You've already proven that." Tessa looked at him for a few more seconds, then shook her head. "I don't take gifts from strangers. I don't know who you are, but I know men like you don't come looking for mechanics in this neighborhood just because they need a car fixed." "This isn't a gift," Nico said, slowing his voice, calm and even. "I'm short on skilled mechanics. You have the hands for the work. You work. I pay you. Fair exchange. Nobody owes anybody." Tessa didn't answer. She looked toward the van parked across the street. Through the fogged glass, Benji was sitting inside, drawing on the window with one finger. The boy was drawing a house, with a pointed roof, a window, and a tree beside it, something he'd never had. Winter was coming. The night before, the temperature had dropped so low that Tessa had to hold Benji against her all night just to keep him warm. The van had no heat. Their only blanket had grown so thin she could almost see through it. She knew that Van wouldn't survive another cold season, and she knew her son wouldn't either. Tessa turned back to Nico. She didn't say yes. She didn't say thank you. She only said, her voice low and clear, "When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning." She gave one nod, then turned and walked back toward the pickup she hadn't finished repairing. Nico watched her for a moment, then turned back to the car. Frankie opened the door and asked quietly. "She agreed?" "She did." "Boss wants me to check anything else about her?" "No need. She's not dangerous." Frankie looked at his boss through the rearview mirror as the car rolled away. In 15 years, Frankie had never seen Nico Valenti go to the trouble of finding someone simply because that person had refused to take his money. The Valenti boss wasn't the kind of man who got curious about anyone. And yet today, he had driven halfway across the city to offer work to a homeless girl. Frankie said nothing. But in his mind, a small bell began to ring, the kind of bell that, after 15 years, he understood very well. Something was about to change. As for Tessa, when the black car disappeared from sight, she walked over to the van, opened the door, and sat down beside Benji. The boy looked up and pointed at the picture on the glass. "Look, Mommy, it's our house." Tessa looked at the house drawn by a finger on the fogged window, knowing that in just a few minutes, the moisture would erase it completely. She pulled her son into her arms. She hadn't nodded because she trusted that man. She had nodded because her son was drawing a home on a car window, and she couldn't let that dream remain nothing but mist forever. The next morning, Tessa took Benji to the daycare near the garage, then walked in to start work. Nico's garage wasn't like any place she had ever set foot in before. The concrete floor was polished smooth. The white lights shone evenly overhead, and 4 wide service bays stood in a straight line, each one hung with a brand new set of tools worth more than everything she had ever owned in her life put together. Under the lights, 3 luxury cars were waiting to be repaired, each one worth as much as the entire house Tessa had once had, then lost. She had just set her backpack down when she heard a whistle behind her. A large mechanic with a buzz cut and tattoos running all the way up to his neck was leaning against a tool cabinet, looking her over from head to toe. Paulie, the lead mechanic of the garage. He had worked here for 5 years, and he was the man the rest of the crew followed. "This the new mechanic the boss hired?" Paulie said loudly enough for the whole garage to hear. "I thought we were working in a luxury car garage, not a car wash." 2 other mechanics gave low, mocking laughs. Tessa didn't look up. She unzipped her backpack, took out her father's old tool set, and arranged it neatly on the workbench. Paulie stepped closer. "Hey, if you want to prove you deserve to stand here, I've got a little test." He pointed toward the corner of the garage, where a silver Porsche sat motionless with its hood open. "That one's been sitting there for 2 weeks. Electrical issue. Nobody in the whole garage can find it." Even the dealership tech came down, took one look, and shook his head. "You fix it, and I won't say another word. You don't fix it, don't complain about what happens next." Tessa looked at the Porsche. Then she looked back at Paulie. "Where are the keys?" Paulie tossed the keys over. Tessa caught them with one hand and walked straight toward the car without saying another word. She began by starting the engine and listening. The engine coughed a few times, then died. She turned the key off, opened the hood, and checked the main wiring system. Everything looked normal. She moved around to the side, removed the fuse box cover, and checked each fuse one by one. None were blown. She lay down beneath the car, shining a flashlight along the wiring, following each branch as though she were reading a map she knew by heart. The 3 mechanics stood a few yards away. At first, they kept muttering under their breath. Then, slowly, they went quiet. Paulie crossed his arms, leaned against a column, and didn't take his eyes off Tessa. 1 hour passed. Then 2. Tessa removed the dashboard layer by layer, gently, patiently, like someone peeling back skin to reach the hidden center underneath. She didn't rush. She didn't get angry. She only worked, and kept working. By the 3rd hour, Tessa stopped. She pulled her hand out from behind the dashboard, and between 2 fingers was a small relay hidden deep in a blind corner no one had thought to check. The relay had shorted. Its contact was flickering, unstable enough to paralyze the entire electrical system, but not enough to trigger an error on the diagnostic scanner. The kind of fault an ordinary mechanic could spend a whole month searching for and still never find, because he trusted the screen more than he trusted his own hands. Tessa replaced the relay with a new one from the garage's parts room, put the dashboard back together, reconnected the wires, then sat down in the driver's seat. She turned the key. The Porsche engine came to life. Smooth, powerful, perfect. The sound of the engine ran steady, like a healthy heartbeat. The whole garage went silent. Paulie straightened, his arms dropping from his chest. The other 2 mechanics looked at each other. No one was laughing anymore. Tessa turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, wiped her hands on her pant leg, and walked straight back to her workbench. She didn't look at Paulie. She didn't wait for anyone to praise her. She didn't say a single word. She simply picked up the next work order and began again, as though what had just happened wasn't worth mentioning. Polly stood there watching her. He opened his mouth as if he meant to say something, then closed it again. From that moment on, no one in the garage said another word about whether this girl deserved to stand there or not. That afternoon, when Tessa picked Benji up from daycare, she led her son into the small room behind the garage that Nico had arranged for them. The room wasn't big, but it had a real bed, a blanket, pillows, and a private bathroom with hot water. Benji ran inside, climbed onto the bed, and lay down. He rolled back and forth on the mattress, then looked up at his mother, his eyes wide and round. "Mommy," the bed's soft. Those 3 words. Just 3 words. But they were heavier than anything Tessa had heard in the past 2 years. Because for 2 years, her son had slept curled up on a folded car seat, shivering under a thin blanket, inside a van with no heat in the middle of winter. For 2 years, she had tried with everything she had, and it still hadn't been enough to give her child a bed. Benji pulled the blanket up to his neck, hugged the wooden car his grandfather had made by hand, and closed his eyes. In less than 3 minutes, he was sound asleep, his lips slightly parted, his breathing light and even. Tessa sat on the edge of the bed, looking at her son. She bit down hard on her lower lip until she tasted salt. Not because she was sad, but because for the first time in a very long time, her son was sleeping without trembling from the cold. She didn't know who the man named Nico Valenti truly was. She didn't know what that gleaming garage was hiding behind its polished surface. But tonight, her child had a bed, a blanket, and deep sleep. Tonight, that was enough. 2 weeks had passed since the day Tessa walked into the garage. She came to work on time, fixed the cars, then went back to her room. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, and she didn't leave necessary words unsaid. The mechanics in the garage slowly got used to her presence. Polly didn't make things harder for her anymore, but he wasn't friendly either. He only kept the quiet distance of a man who had been beaten, but wasn't ready to admit it. Nico stopped by the garage from time to time, glanced toward Tessa's work bay, but said nothing. She didn't look up either. The two of them existed in the same space like 2 parallel lines, close, but never touching, until that night. Benji had been sound asleep since 8 o'clock. Tessa remembered that she had left her son's coat in the locker, out by the service bay, the only coat warm enough for him to wear to daycare the next morning. She left the room and walked down the back hallway behind the garage. The garage should have been dark and empty at that hour, but the light in the private back room was still on. The door was cracked open, and Tessa heard voices. Nico's voice, but not the voice she had heard before. The voice he used on the day he offered her the job had been calm, controlled. This voice was different. Lower, slower, and heavy as lead. Tessa knew she should turn back, but her feet didn't obey. She stood close to the hallway wall and looked through the narrow opening in the door. Inside, a man was sitting in a chair across from Nico. He was around 40, his shirt wrinkled, sweat beading on his forehead even though the room wasn't hot. His name was Donnie. Tessa didn't know that then. She only learned it later, when she pieced the fragments together one by one. Donnie was one of Nico's men, handling collections and payments for one of the Valenti family's business routes. He had been skimming money for 6 months and using it to pay off gambling debt. But worse than that, he owed money to the very people tied to Carmine Farrow. And when Farrow found out Donnie belonged to Nico, Donnie was forced to hand over internal financial information from the Valenti family to clear his debt. Donnie hadn't meant to betray anyone, but the result was exactly the same. Nico sat across from Donnie, his back resting against the chair, both hands placed on the table. In front of him were 2 things: a thick envelope, enough money for Donnie to pay off all his debt and still have something left to start over somewhere else, and a phone, its screen showing a family photo of Donnie's wife and 2 small children smiling in a backyard. "I don't touch family," Nico said, his voice neither rising nor falling, neither quick nor slow, steady as the ticking of a clock hand. "You know that. You've been with me for 10 years, and you know I'm not that kind of man. But Farrow is different. You opened the door and let Farrow step into our house. You let him see things he never should have seen, and now he knows you're the weakest link." Nico pushed the envelope toward Donnie. "Take it. Get your wife and children out of the city tonight. Go anywhere. The farther the better. Don't call anyone. Don't tell anyone. Don't come back." Then he stopped and looked straight into Donnie's eyes. "Or you stay here. And when Farrow realizes you're no longer useful to him, Farrow will be the one who deals with you, not me." Donnie looked at the envelope, then at the family photo on the phone. His hand shook as he picked up the envelope. He stood, his mouth moving as if he wanted to say something, but no sound came out. Then he turned around, walked toward the door, his head lowered. Only Nico and Frankie remained in the room. Frankie stood in the corner with his arms crossed over his chest, watching the door that had just closed. "Why didn't you handle him more cleanly, boss?" Frankie asked. Nico didn't look at Frankie. He looked at the phone that was still showing Donnie's family photo on the table, because he has little kids. Frankie said nothing more. He picked up the phone, turned off the screen, and put it in his pocket. Nico stood and walked toward the door. He opened it, then stopped. Tessa was standing right outside in the hallway. Less than a yard separated them. Her eyes looked straight into his, and in that gaze, Nico saw something he rarely saw in anyone who looked at him. Not fear, not judgment, but recognition. The kind of gaze that belonged to a person who had just put the final piece of a puzzle exactly where it belonged. Nico didn't explain. He didn't apologize. He only said 4 words, his voice flat as the surface of dark water. "This is my world." Then he stepped past her, walked down the hallway, and disappeared into the darkness. Tessa stood there for a few more seconds. Then she took Benji's coat from the locker and returned to the room. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to her son's steady breathing beside her, and she understood that the soft bed Benji was sleeping in, the warm room where the two of them were staying, all of it rested in the hands of a man whose true face she had just seen. The next morning, Tessa waited for Nico at the garage door. He arrived at 9 o'clock, as usual, walking in with a cup of coffee in his hand. She stopped him before he could pass. "You're not just the owner of a garage." Nico stopped, looked at her. "No. What are you?" "I'm someone you shouldn't know too much about." Tessa nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in confirmation. She went back to the room and began packing things into her backpack. Benji's coat, the wooden car, her father's tool set. She zipped the backpack shut, slung it over her shoulder, and walked toward the door. Nico stood in the hallway. He didn't block her path, he only asked, his voice carrying no hint of pleading and no trace of command. "Where will you go? Back to the van? Let Benji face winter on the street?" Tessa stopped. Her back was turned to Nico. She stood that way for a very long time, the backpack heavy on her shoulder, and she knew he was right. She knew that outside was December, cold wind, nights when the van shook under the gusts, and Benji curled into himself, unable to sleep. She knew she didn't have a better choice than this place, and she hated that. She turned back, looked straight into Nico's eyes. "I'm staying because of my son. I work, I take my pay, and I don't get involved in anything that belongs to you. That's my only condition." Nico looked at her, then nodded. "Fine." Tessa set the backpack down, turned away, and walked into the service bay. She took out her tools and began the workday as if the conversation had never happened. But from that moment on, an invisible line was drawn between them. Tessa stood on one side, Nico stood on the other. She would fix cars for him, take the money to feed her child, and she wouldn't cross that line by even half a step. She had trusted a man once, and that man had taken everything from her. She wouldn't make that mistake a second time. And Nico, standing on the other side of the line, watched her walk away, and for the first time in many years, he found himself wanting to step across to where she was. But he didn't, because he knew that in his world, anything he touched was in danger of breaking. Tessa kept her word. In the days after the confrontation, she came to the garage on time, fixed cars, took her pay, then went back to the room with Benji. She didn't ask Nico anything. She didn't look toward the private room in the back. She wasn't curious about the people who came and went at night. She drew a clear boundary between herself and Nico Valenti's world, and she held that boundary with all the stubbornness life had taught her. But boundaries were easy to draw. Keeping them was the hard part. One night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, a pipe burst in Tessa's bathroom. Water sprayed everywhere. Tessa rushed in to shut off the main valve and used towels to block the leak for the moment, but she didn't have the tools to fix it. The pipe needed an entire section replaced. It needed a large wrench and heat-resistant tape, things her father's car repair tools didn't have. She mopped the floor until nearly dawn, then fell asleep on the chair, while Benji still slept peacefully on the bed, knowing nothing. The next morning, when Tessa opened the door to take Benji to daycare, she almost tripped over something sitting right on the threshold. A complete plumbing repair kit, wrench, tape, replacement pipe, all neatly placed inside a canvas bag. No note, no words. Tessa stood there staring at the kit for a long time. She knew there was only one person in this garage who could know what had broken in her room without her saying a word, because that person controlled everything in this building, from the camera in the hallway to the strange sound of running water at 2 o'clock in the morning. She didn't say thank you, but that night, she fixed the pipe by herself. Over the following weeks, Tessa began to realize that the boundary she had drawn wasn't being crossed, but it was being blurred by very small things. One rainy day, she came home from work and found that a waterproof tarp had been added to the awning in front of her room, just enough to keep Benji from getting soaked when he ran from the door into the yard. No one admitted doing it. Another day, the carton of milk in her small refrigerator was almost empty. The next morning, there was a new one. No one admitted leaving it there. The things were so small that Tessa couldn't call them gifts, couldn't call them favors, only things that appeared at exactly the moment she needed them, without any condition attached. One afternoon, after work, Tessa sat on the garage floor, teaching Benji how to recognize different kinds of wrenches. The boy sat cross-legged across from his mother, his tiny hands holding the smallest wrench, tilting his head as he studied it with a seriousness so deep it was almost funny. Tessa pointed to each one, named it, let him touch it, let him compare the sizes, exactly the way her father had once taught her in his small suburban garage when she was little. Benji set the wrench down, reached for the wooden car his grandfather had made by hand, and held it up. "Mommy, when will we have our own garage like Grandpa?" Tessa looked at her son. He asked with the innocent voice of a 4-year-old child, unaware of how heavy that question truly was. She smiled and brushed his hair back. "We will, sweetheart." She didn't know Nico was standing outside the garage door, hearing every word. One day, Tessa was sitting in the backyard of the garage eating lunch when Frankie walked by, stopped, and lit a cigarette. The two of them weren't close, but they had become familiar enough that being near each other no longer felt forced. Frankie took a long drag and looked out toward the parking lot. "I've been with the boss for 15 years, he said, not looking at Tessa, as if he were talking to himself. "He isn't a good man, don't misunderstand that, but he has a line that nobody in this world has, and he's never crossed it." Frankie put out the cigarette, stood, and went back inside. He didn't say another word. Tessa remained sitting there alone, watching him go, and she remembered that night, Nico sitting across from Donnie, placing the envelope of money in front of him, then saying, "Because he has little kids." She thought about the line Frankie had just mentioned, and she wondered how wide that line really was. That night, Tessa finished repairing the last car on her shift. She wiped her hands, turned off the lights in the service bay, and was about to return to her room. But when she passed through the inner parking area, she saw Nico sitting alone on a folding chair beside the last bay, a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. He had come to the garage late because of work, and he looked as if he had just reached the end of a very long day. Normally, Tessa would have walked straight past, but tonight, for reasons she didn't understand, she stopped. "When did you start fixing cars?" Nico asked, his voice ordinary, not the voice of a boss, just the voice of someone asking because he truly wanted to know. "When I was 8, Tessa said, leaning her back against a column. "My father had a small garage out in the suburbs. He taught me from the simplest things. How to hold a wrench, how to listen to an engine, how to tell where a car was hurting just by hearing it. He said fixing cars was like treating the sick. You had to listen first, then touch." "Is he still alive?" "No. My father died when I was 19. Lung disease. The medical debt piled up, and even after I sold the garage, it wasn't enough to pay it off. After that, I worked every kind of job from morning until night just to pay the rest." Tessa paused. Her voice didn't tremble, didn't sound sad, only flat and quiet, like someone telling a story that belonged to someone else, not herself. "Then I met Craig. He acted kind, said he'd take care of me. I was too tired to be suspicious, so I married him." She looked down at her hands. Craig controlled everything. The wages I earned, he kept. The accounts were in his name. When I filed for divorce, I found out he had tricked me into signing away everything. The house, the car, the savings. I went to court with no lawyer. He had one. I lost everything. Then he disappeared and left me with Benji, without a dollar, without a roof over our heads. Nico said nothing the whole time Tessa spoke. He didn't ask for more. He didn't comfort her. He didn't look at her with pity. He simply sat there, the cold cup of coffee in his hand, and listened. Tessa didn't know why she was telling him these things. She hadn't told anyone since the day she walked out of that courthouse. Maybe because Nico didn't ask, "Are you okay?" the way other people did. Maybe because he looked at her without pity, only with the quiet attention of a man who understood that some wounds didn't need anyone to bandage them. They only needed someone silent enough to sit beside them. The two of them sat in the garage and said nothing more. The air conditioner hummed overhead. The familiar smell of motor oil hung in the air. Tessa didn't know how long it had been since she had last sat still like this beside another person, without having to keep watch, without having to brace herself, without having to be ready to leave. She didn't trust Nico. She still didn't trust him. But tonight, in the empty garage, for the first time, the distance between the Valenti boss and the homeless mechanic no longer felt as far as it had before. 3 o'clock in the morning. Tessa woke because a small hand, burning hot, was gripping her wrist. She opened her eyes, turned to the side, and her heart tightened. Benji was lying beside her, his face flushed red, his lips dry and cracked, his eyes squeezed shut while his eyelids fluttered again and again. She placed a hand on his forehead, and he was so hot that she pulled her hand back by instinct. A high fever. A very high fever. She called his name. Benji opened his eyes in a daze, looking at his mother but not really seeing her, his eyes cloudy as if he were somewhere very far away. "Mommy, I'm cold," the boy said in a weak voice, while his body burned like coal. Tessa lifted him, held him against her chest, and ran her hands over Benji's body. She didn't have health insurance. Her account had less than $40 left, enough to buy milk and food for the coming week, not enough for one emergency room visit. She knew the hospital wouldn't turn a child away, but she also knew the bill afterward would be a number she couldn't pay in an entire year. But that was for later. Right now, her son had a fever, and she needed to take him in immediately. She looked at her phone. Calling a taxi meant waiting, maybe half an hour in this neighborhood at this hour. Calling emergency services meant an ambulance bill that would crush her. She sat on the bed, holding Benji, and in that moment, only one name came into her mind. She hated it. She hated that the only person she could call at 3 o'clock in the morning was a man she knew very well was dangerous. But her child had a fever, and pride couldn't bring a temperature down. She dialed Nico's number. The phone rang twice. "Hello?" His voice was alert, not sleepy at all. He was still at the garage, working late as usual. "Benji has a high fever. I need to take him to the hospital. I don't have a car," Tessa said quickly, her voice controlled, not trembling. But Nico heard what she was trying to hide underneath, the fear of a mother whose child was sick when she could do nothing. "I'm coming now." Nico hung up. He didn't ask how high the fever was. He didn't ask whether Benji had taken medicine. He didn't ask a single unnecessary question. 3 minutes later, Tessa heard an engine start outside in the yard. She carried Benji out, and Nico already had the back door open. She got in, holding her son in her lap. Benji curled into her, shivering lightly. Nico drove out of the garage without saying a word. On the road, he took out his phone and made one call. "Dr. Harmon, I need him at St. Mary Hospital in 15 minutes. Child, high fever. Handle everything." Then he hung up. Tessa sat in the back, looking at the back of Nico's head, and she understood that handle everything in Nico Valenti's language meant everything. The hospital bill, the doctor, the room, the medicine, all of it. She wanted to say something, wanted to say she would pay for it herself, that she didn't need anyone taking care of her. But Benji was trembling in her arms, and she had no strength to say anything except, "Hurry," whispered softly enough that only she could hear. 12 minutes later, the car stopped in front of the emergency entrance. Dr. Harmon was already standing by the door with 2 nurses beside him. Benji was taken into the pediatric examination room immediately, with no line, no forms, no questions about insurance. Tessa followed her son, her eyes never leaving Benji. Nico stayed in the hallway, his hands in his pockets, his back against the wall, waiting. More than an hour later, Dr. Harmon came out. An acute respiratory infection, a high fever, but it had come down with medication. The child needed to stay overnight for observation, but he wasn't in danger. After Tessa heard that, her legs went weak, and she had to brace a hand against the wall to keep from falling. She nodded and thanked the doctor, then turned back into the hospital room. Benji lay on the bed, his fever lowered, his eyes closed, his breathing even and light. The redness in his face had softened, and his lips were no longer dry and cracked. Tessa sat down in the chair beside the bed, held her son's hand, and for the first time since waking at 3 o'clock in the morning, she cried. Not loudly, not with sobs, just tears running silently down her cheeks, falling onto the back of the hand holding her son's, while her shoulders shook slightly like someone trying to hold back something too heavy. Tessa didn't know when Nico entered the room. When she lifted her head, he was already sitting in the plastic chair on the other side of Benji's bed. His back was straight, his hands resting on his thighs, his eyes on the sleeping child. He said nothing. He didn't ask whether she was okay. He didn't say he would take care of everything. He only sat there, silent, in the stark white hospital room at 4 o'clock in the morning. And his presence, the simple fact that he was there, was something Tessa hadn't known she needed until she had it. It was nearly dawn when the doctor came in for one final check, then left. The hospital room was quiet, with only the steady beeping of the heart monitor remaining. Tessa wiped her eyes, took a long breath, then looked at Nico. I'll pay back the hospital bill. No matter how long it takes, I'll pay it back. I'm not lending it, Nico said, his voice low and calm. I want to do it. Why? Tessa asked. And this was the first time she asked Nico that question, because she truly wanted to hear the answer, not because she was defending herself. Nico didn't look at Tessa. He looked at Benji, at the 4-year-old boy sleeping deeply in the hospital bed, his face calmer now, his breathing even, one tiny hand loosely holding the edge of the blanket. Because no child should have to be afraid while sleeping. Tessa looked at him. She saw Nico Valenti, the man the whole city feared, sitting on a hard plastic chair in a pediatric hospital room at almost 5 o'clock in the morning because of a child who wasn't his, saying something she knew he wasn't saying for her benefit, but because he truly believed it. She didn't answer. She only looked at him, and for the first time since she had walked into the garage, she didn't see the crime boss, didn't see the danger, didn't see the underworld. She only saw a man staying awake with her through the longest night of her life without asking for anything in return. Near 6 o'clock in the morning, Benji stirred. The boy opened his eyes and blinked around the unfamiliar hospital room. His eyes searched for his mother first. Tessa bent down and kissed his forehead. Mommy's here. You're okay now. Benji nodded weakly. Then his eyes moved to the other side of the bed. He saw Nico, the large man sitting on a small plastic chair, his shirt wrinkled, the skin beneath his eyes dark from staying awake all night, but still sitting there, still not gone. Benji looked at Nico with the dazed eyes of a child who had just come through a fever. Eyes not awake enough to understand what was happening, but awake enough to feel who was beside him. The boy's tiny hand reached out, stretching past the edge of the bed, and took Nico's hand. Stay here with me, okay? 5 words. Hoarse, weak words from a 4-year-old child who had just survived a high fever in the middle of the night. But those 5 words did what no one in the past 10 years had been able to do. Nico looked down at the tiny hand holding his, those small fingers wrapped around his index finger, warm, soft, and completely trusting in the way only children know how to trust. Without conditions, without suspicion, without calculation. Nico didn't pull his hand away. He didn't say anything. He only sat there, letting that small hand hold his, and Tessa, sitting on the other side of the bed, watched the scene through tears she no longer bothered to wipe away. She saw a child trust before his mother dared to. And she wondered whether, sometimes, children could see a person's true self far more clearly than adults ever could. It wasn't that she suddenly trusted Nico. It wasn't that she forgot who he was, but there was something small, buried deep inside her chest. Something she couldn't name, something she felt every time she remembered the image of that man sitting on a hard plastic chair at 4 o'clock in the morning, letting a child who wasn't his hold his hand, and not pulling away. She didn't know how to repay Nico. She had no money. She had nothing but her hands and her father's tool set. But sometimes, that was enough. In the deepest corner of the garage, behind the last service bay, there was a car covered with a gray tarp that no one in the garage was allowed to touch. Tessa had seen it from her first day there. A large shape sitting motionless in the shadows, covered in dust, like something someone wanted to keep but didn't dare look at. She had never asked about it, until one afternoon, when she happened to walk past and stopped to look. Polly was standing nearby, wiping down tools. He saw Tessa looking at the covered car, and he spoke without her needing to ask. '67 Mustang. Boss's father's car. The old man died 10 years ago. Boss keeps it, but he never fixes it, and he doesn't let anyone touch it either. A new mechanic came in last year, lifted the tarp to take a look out of curiosity, and got fired the next day. Nobody touches that car. Nobody. Polly walked away. Tessa stayed there for a few more seconds, looking at the gray tarp, then returned to her work bay. But that night, after the garage had closed, after Benji was sound asleep in their room, she went back to that dark corner. She lifted the tarp, gently, slowly, as though she were uncovering something sacred. The 1967 Ford Mustang lay there, covered in 10 years of dust. The original red paint had dulled, but it hadn't peeled. The body wasn't bent. There wasn't heavy rust. The frame was still solid. Tessa opened the hood and shone a flashlight inside. The carburetor was bad. The ignition system needed replacing. The spark plugs were dead. The belt was rotted, but the V8 engine was still intact, sitting quietly in the engine bay like a heart in winter sleep, waiting for someone to wake it. Tessa looked at the car, and she knew. This car could come back to life. Not patched up just enough to run, but truly alive again. She covered it back up, turned off the light, and returned to the room. But her mind had already begun making a list. Carburetor, spark plugs, belt, ignition set. She calculated each part, which ones she could take from the garage's parts room, which ones she could make work with her father's tools, which ones she would have to find some other way. The next night, after Benji fell asleep, she went back, and the night after that, and the night after that, every night, after finishing her shift, after getting her son to sleep, Tessa slipped out to the garage, pulled back the tarp, turned on her flashlight, and worked. She removed the old carburetor, cleaned every piece, replaced the parts that couldn't be saved with components she found in the storage room. She replaced the spark plugs, changed the belt, checked every wire, every connection, every small valve. She worked with her father's old tool set, the worn-down wrenches she had used since she was 13, along with a few things from the garage's shared tool rack. She didn't turn on the main lights, only used a flashlight and a small cord light clipped to the hood. She worked in silence, in the dark, alone. Some nights, she worked until 1 o'clock in the morning. Some nights until 2 o'clock. Her back ached from lying beneath the car on the cold concrete floor. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. But each time she looked at the Mustang, at the engine slowly coming back to life beneath her hands, she thought of her father. She thought of the small suburban garage, of those afternoons when father and daughter lay beneath cars together, when he pointed out each part to her, named each detail, then said, "Every car can be fixed, Tessa. You just have to be patient and know how to listen to where it hurts." She was repairing another man's father's car, and she understood, more than anyone, that this car wasn't just a car. It was the last thing a father had left his son before he went away. It was a keepsake, a memory, the sound of an engine that the son had perhaps believed he would never hear again. 2 weeks, 14 nights. Tessa worked alone and told no one. On the final night, she installed the last part, checked the entire system one more time, then sat down in the driver's seat. The old leather seat had hardened and cracked in a few places, but it still held its shape. She placed her hands on the steering wheel, took a long breath, then turned the key. The engine coughed once, then twice, then caught. The V8 roared to life, powerful and deep, rolling through the empty garage at midnight. The engine ran steady, strong, alive, like a heart beating again after 10 years of silence. Tessa sat inside the car, listening to the engine run, and she smiled. For the first time in a very long time, it was a smile, not for Benji, not for anyone else, but simply because she had just done what her father had taught her to do. She had repaired something people thought was broken beyond saving. She turned off the engine, cleaned away every sign that she had been working, covered the car again, turned off the light, went back to the room, and told no one. The next morning, Nico came to the garage earlier than usual. He entered through the back door, a cup of coffee in his hand, and stopped. The Mustang was no longer covered. The gray tarp had been folded neatly and placed on the floor beside it. The car stood there beneath the white lights of the garage, its red paint wiped clean of 10 years of dust, its body shining in a strange way, like something that had just been awakened after a long sleep. Nico stood frozen, the cup of coffee in his hand tilted, and he didn't even notice. Frankie stood behind him, silent, waiting. "Who did this?" Nico asked, and his voice was different. Not the voice of a boss, not the voice of a man giving an order, but the voice of someone so caught off guard he didn't have time to hide it. Frankie stepped up beside him and spoke quietly. She did. Tessa. Every night after work she came out here and repaired it. 2 weeks straight. I saw it on the cameras. But I didn't say anything because I wanted to see what she was going to do. Frankie stopped. She finished it, boss. Completely. Nico set the coffee cup down on the nearest table. He walked over to the Mustang and touched the hood. The metal felt cool beneath his palm. He opened the car door and sat in the driver's seat. The old leather seat still held the shape he remembered, cracked in a few lines, harder than before. But it was still the same seat where he had once sat beside his father every Sunday afternoon, while father and son drove along the north shore of Ashford City. The windows rolled down, the salt wind blowing in, and his father laughing, that rare smile of a man the whole city feared, but who was softer with his son than he was with anyone else. Nico placed his hands on the steering wheel, right where his father used to hold it, hands at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. He always said, "You drive with proper posture, son, no matter how much of a hurry you're in." Nico turned the key. The V8 engine roared to life. That sound, the sound he had thought for 10 years had been buried underground with his father. The deep, powerful, steady rumble shook the entire cabin and moved down his spine like a familiar hand settling on his shoulder. The sound of Sunday afternoons, of the shoreline, of salt wind, of his father. Nico sat still in the car, both hands on the wheel, his eyes looking straight through the windshield, though he saw nothing. He listened to the engine run, and 10 years folded into a single moment. Everything he had believed was lost suddenly returned through one sound. Frankie stood outside the car, watching his boss sit motionless. In 15 years beside Nico, Frankie had seen him face men who wanted to take his life without the slightest change in expression. He had seen him make decisions that could shift the entire balance of power in the city, without a tremor in his voice. But Frankie had never seen Nico like this, sitting silently in his father's old car, both hands gripping the steering wheel, unable to say a single word. Frankie stepped out of the garage and closed the door gently, giving his boss a space no one else should witness. 15 minutes later, Nico turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. His eyes had returned to normal, and his face had gathered itself back into its familiar control. But Frankie knew, and Nico knew too, that in those 15 minutes, the cold shell the Valenti boss had built over 10 years had cracked, truly cracked, for the first time. When Tessa came to the garage to begin her shift, Nico was waiting in the last bay, right beside the Mustang. She looked at the uncovered car, looked at Nico standing next to it, and understood that he knew. She said nothing, only stopped and waited. "Why did you do this?" Nico asked. His voice was calm. But beneath that calm, Tessa heard something she had never heard in his voice before. A fracture. Small, but real. Tessa looked at the Mustang, then back at Nico. "Because I know what it's like to lose a father," she said, her voice soft, not trying to make it dramatic, only telling the truth. "And this car isn't a car. It's the last thing he left you." Nico looked at her, and in that moment, Tessa saw something she had never seen in this man before. Not coldness, not power, not control, but the helplessness of someone who had just been touched in the most painful place and hadn't had time to defend himself. Nico didn't say thank you. Maybe because thank you wasn't enough. Maybe because he didn't know how to say those words to someone who had given him something money couldn't buy. He only nodded, a slow, heavy nod, then turned and walked away. That night, Tessa finished repairing the last car on her shift, wiped her hands, and turned off the bay lights. She was passing through the inner parking area when she saw Nico sitting on the hood of the Mustang, his back resting against the windshield, both legs stretched out. He wasn't doing anything, only sitting there in the empty garage, beside his father's car. Tessa meant to walk straight past, but her steps slowed, then stopped. She leaned her back against a nearby column, a few steps away from Nico. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The garage was quiet except for the steady hum of the air conditioner overhead. Then Nico spoke, his voice low. "The last time I sat in this car, my father was driving. We were going along the North Shore. He didn't talk much. He just drove, and I sat beside him. That was the last Sunday afternoon before he died." Tessa listened. She didn't say, "I understand," or "me too." She only stood there, and her silence was what Nico needed more than any words. The air in the garage changed. Lighter. Warmer. The distance between them was shrinking, not by footsteps, but by something invisible that both of them could feel. Nico looked at Tessa. Tessa looked back. And in that moment, she saw him not as a crime boss, not as the boss, but only as a man sitting on his father's car, missing his father, and she was the only person there. But then Tessa pulled back. Not with her feet, but in her eyes. She looked down, took a breath, and when she lifted her gaze again, the softness from a moment before had vanished, replaced by the familiar wall she had built from every wound in her life. "I trusted a man once," she said, her voice quiet but every word clear. "He said he would take care of me. He said I wouldn't have to worry about anything anymore. Then he took everything. The house, the money, even the name on the deed. I walked out of that courthouse with Benji in my arms and one backpack." She looked straight into Nico's eyes. "I have nothing left but my son, and I don't have the strength to lose anything again." Nico listened. He didn't argue. He didn't say, "I'm different." He didn't make promises. He only looked at her. And in his eyes, Tessa didn't see hurt or disappointment. She saw understanding, the kind of understanding that belonged to someone who knew there were walls no one had the right to break. Only the person who built them had the right to take them down. Nico slid down from the hood and stood straight. He looked at Tessa for one more second, then said, his voice even but not cold, "Good night, Tessa." Then he walked out of the garage without looking back. Tessa stood alone beside the Mustang, listening to Nico's footsteps fade down the hallway. She knew she had just pushed him away. She knew he might not step close again. And she knew, deep inside, that tonight she had said the right thing, but being right didn't always mean it didn't hurt. The past never disappears completely. It only lies still somewhere, waiting for the exact moment when she has just begun to breathe again, just begun to think that maybe life might become a little less cruel, and then it comes back, knocking at the door with a face she thought she had forgotten. It was Wednesday. Benji had been at daycare since morning. Tessa was lying beneath a sedan, repairing the exhaust system, when she heard unfamiliar footsteps in the garage. Not a mechanic's footsteps. Not Frankie's. Not Nico's. These steps were lighter, more hesitant. The steps of someone who didn't belong in this place, and knew it. She slid out from under the car, lifted her head, and the blood in her body turned cold. Craig Whitfield was standing in the middle of the garage, both hands in his pockets, smiling. That smile Tessa had once believed was sincere. That smile it had taken her 3 years to understand had been false from beginning to end. He was thinner than before, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes sunken, looking like a man who hadn't slept enough in months. But the smile was still the same, still the smile that had tricked her into signing every paper without reading it. "Tessa," Craig said, his voice soft, full of carefully rehearsed remorse. "You look better than before. I've been looking everywhere for you." Tessa stood up. Her hands were still holding the wrench, not because she meant to use it, but because she needed to hold on tightly to something to keep herself standing. "What are you doing here?" "I want to see Benji." Craig stepped closer. "I know I was wrong. I left, and I regret it every day. I just want to see my son. That's all." Tessa looked straight into Craig's eyes. She had once looked into those eyes and seen a future, safety, someone who would stay beside her. Now she looked into them and saw only the papers he had tricked her into signing, the house she had lost, the nights when she had held Benji in the van in the middle of winter. "You lost that right the day you signed the divorce papers and disappeared," Tessa said, her voice steady. "You didn't ask about him once in 3 years. Not one call. Not $1 of child support. You're not a father. You're just the man whose name once appeared on a birth certificate." The smile faded from Craig's face. He looked around the garage, at the luxury cars, at the expensive equipment, and Tessa saw his eyes change. Those were calculating eyes, the eyes she had been too blind to recognize throughout the marriage, eyes that measured everything in money. "Fine," Craig said, his tone changing, the mask of remorse dropping away as quickly as a paper mask. "Then I'll speak plainly. I know who you're working for. I know this place isn't an ordinary garage. And I know that if I go to court and say you're letting our child live inside a facility tied to an underground organization, letting him be exposed to people like this, the court will review custody. I have a lawyer. You don't." Tessa stood still. Her hand gripped the wrench so tightly that her knuckles went white. Not because she was afraid of Craig. She had stopped being afraid of him a long time ago. But the words custody were different. Those words could take Benji out of her arms, and that was the only thing on earth that could make Tessa tremble. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice lower now. Craig smiled. "I just need a small amount, so I can get my life stable again. Then I'll leave, and I won't come back. Consider it me selling back my right to be a father." Tessa looked at Craig, and she saw more clearly than ever that he hadn't come back for Benji. He had come back for money. He had sniffed out that Tessa was near someone with money, and he had come to squeeze the last drop from the woman he had already drained dry 3 years ago. But knowing that was one thing, fighting it was another. She had no lawyer, no money to hire one, and Craig was right about one thing. If he took this to court, if he said she was letting their child live in Nico Valenti's garage, then even if the court didn't believe him, the investigation itself would be enough for Tessa to lose everything. Craig left after saying he would come back at the end of the week to hear her answer. Tessa stood alone in the middle of the garage, still holding the wrench, and for the first time since walking into that place, she felt the wall she had built around herself begin to shake. Tessa didn't tell Nico, but she didn't need to. The garage had cameras, and Frankie watched the cameras every day. That night, Frankie placed a short report on Nico's desk. Craig Whitfield, 32 years old, currently in Ashford City, owed $42,000 in gambling debt to a group of private creditors, had sold every asset he had taken from Tessa within 1 year after the divorce, and was living in a cheap motel on the west side of the city. He hadn't come back because of his son. He had come back because his creditors had backed him into a corner, and Tessa was the easiest prey he knew. Nico finished reading, then closed the file. He said nothing to Frankie. He only said, "Invite him to the restaurant tomorrow night, 9 o'clock. The next night, Nico's restaurant was closed. All the lights were off except for one table in the deepest corner. Craig stepped inside, his eyes moving around uneasily. Frankie stood at the door, arms crossed, his face expressionless. Nico sat at the table, a thick file in front of him. Craig sat down across from him, trying to keep his confidence in place. "Who are you?" Nico didn't answer the question. He opened the file and turned it toward Craig. Inside were copies of the divorce papers Craig had used to trick Tessa into signing away her property, records of 3 years of unpaid child support, gambling debt files with exact amounts and creditor names, and the recording of Craig's conversation at the garage the day before, when he had threatened Tessa. Enough evidence for Craig to face property fraud, failure to meet child support obligations, and illegal debt. Craig looked at the file. His face slowly went white. "2 choices," Nico said, his voice as flat as if he were reading a menu. 1. You sign away every right to the child completely. After you sign, you leave the city tonight. You don't come back. You don't make contact. You don't appear." He paused. 2. This file reaches the police and your creditors at the same time. The police will want to talk to you about property fraud. The creditors will want to talk to you about $42,000. I don't think you want to meet both in the same night. Craig looked at Nico, looked at Frankie standing at the door, looked at the file. He understood that the man sitting in front of him wasn't the kind of man who made empty threats, and he understood that he had chosen the wrong person to blackmail. Frankie placed a sheet of paper and a pen in front of Craig. Termination of parental rights paperwork, already prepared. Craig picked up the pen, his hand shaking. He signed, then he stood and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Frankie followed him, making sure he got into a car and left. Nico stayed sitting alone in the dark restaurant. He looked at the paper Craig had just signed, folded it, and placed it inside an envelope. The next morning, Nico came to the garage. He handed Tessa the envelope without saying much. Tessa opened it, read the paper inside, and understood immediately. Craig's signature, giving up every right. She didn't ask Nico what he had said, what he had done, or what method he had used. She knew the answer wouldn't be something she wanted to hear, but the paper in her hand was real, and Craig would never come back. "You didn't have to do that," Tessa said softly. Nico looked at her. "No one threatens your child. No one." Then he turned and walked away. Tessa stood in the middle of the garage, holding the paper, and she realized that the man she had tried to keep at a distance, the man she had pushed away the night before beside the Mustang, had just used the very world she feared to protect the most precious thing she had. And she didn't know how she was supposed to feel about that. Grateful, certainly, but there was something else too. something she didn't dare name, growing inside her chest, and she knew that no matter how many boundaries she drew, that thing refused to stay quiet on the other side. Carmine Farrow wasn't the kind of man who accepted losing. Ever since that night's meeting, when Nico had arrived on time and forced him to give up 3% of the Eastern Territory, Farrow had swallowed that humiliation and waited. He waited like a man who understood that revenge didn't have to be quick, only precise. And while he waited, he found the thing he needed. A card hidden right inside Nico's own house. Paulie, the lead mechanic of the garage. The man who had worked for Nico for 5 years, long enough to know the boss's schedule, close enough to know who came and went, and greedy enough to be bought. Farrow approached Paulie through a middleman and offered him a number that a mechanic's wages would take 10 years to earn. Paulie wasn't born a traitor. He was only an ordinary man placed in front of a sum of money larger than his conscience could bear. He took the money and began giving Farrow everything. Nico's schedule, his travel habits, the people inside the garage, and especially information about the woman mechanic living behind the garage with her little boy. The woman Paulie was smart enough to realize the boss cared about in a way the boss had never cared about anyone before. Farrow took the information and made his plan. He didn't need to hurt Tessa. He only needed her. Only needed to use her as a piece on the board to force Nico to sit down at the negotiating table from a weaker position. He wanted to take back the Eastern Territory, and more than that, he wanted Nico to know that the Valenti Empire had a crack in it, and that crack had the name of a woman who fixed cars. Thursday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Tessa received a text from an unknown number. The message was brief. A car had broken down on the road near the old warehouse district on the west side of the city. The owner needed a mechanic urgently and was willing to pay 3 times the usual rate. The phone number came with the name of a small garage where Tessa had taken jobs before, back before she worked for Nico. She didn't suspect anything. Taking mobile repair calls like this was what she had done for 2 straight years. She checked again. Benji was safe at daycare. Someone was there to pick him up for the afternoon shift, and she could go and return within 2 hours. She picked up her tool backpack, told the mechanic on duty in the garage that she was stepping out for a little while, then drove her old van to the address that had been sent. The warehouse district on the west side of the city was half industrial, half abandoned. Old warehouses stood in rows, with rusted sheet metal roofs, peeling brick walls, and empty lots covered in weeds. Tessa stopped the van in front of warehouse number 7, the address in the message. There was no broken-down car outside. She got out and looked around. Empty. Quiet. Her stomach tightened by instinct. The instinct of someone who had lived on the street long enough to know when the air wasn't right. She pulled out her phone to call back the number that had texted her, when the warehouse door opened. 2 men stepped out, both large, both cold-faced, moving fast. Before Tessa could turn back toward the van, a 3rd man was already blocking her from behind. She didn't scream. She didn't run, because she knew running wouldn't work. She only gripped the wrench in her hand, stood straight, and looked directly into the eyes of the man in front of her. "What do you want?" "Nothing from you," the man said, his voice calm enough to make the blood go cold. "We only need your boss to come here." They took her inside the warehouse and locked her in a small room in the back, maybe once a guard room or a worker's break room. An iron table, 1 chair, a ceiling bulb, an iron door locked from the outside. One man used his phone to record a video of Tessa sitting in the chair inside the locked room, then sent it out. Tessa knew that video would reach Nico, and she knew that was the entire point. She was bait. A locked room, a sealed door, 1 light bulb. Most people would sit and wait. But Tessa wasn't most people. She had lived for 2 years in a van. She had replaced a fuel pump at midnight in the middle of an industrial district. She had raised a child alone with no money in her pocket. She wasn't the kind of person who sat still waiting for someone to come save her. She studied the room. 4 brick walls, 1 iron door, 1 light bulb connected to the warehouse's old electrical system. She looked up at the ceiling and saw exposed wiring running along the wall, leading from this room into the hallway, tied into the general system for the whole warehouse. Old electrical work, bare wires without conduit, the kind of temporary installation thrown together decades ago. Tessa looked at the iron door. Locked from the outside, bolt on the outside, but the hinges were on the inside. Old hinges, the screws already rusted. She opened her tool backpack. Her father's wrenches were still there. She took out the smallest one and started removing the hinge screws. The screws were rusted, stiff, Hard to turn, but she was patient. 15 minutes. She removed the 2 upper screws, and the top hinge came loose. She went on to the 2 lower screws. Another 20 minutes. The iron door tilted, still held by the outside bolt, but now she could pull it crooked enough to squeeze through the gap between the door and the frame. She slipped through and stepped into the hallway. Outside, she could hear voices echoing from the front of the warehouse. The guards were out there, probably 2 or 3 men. She wasn't sure. She didn't go toward the front. She moved down the hallway toward the back, and she found what she needed: the warehouse's main electrical panel, a metal box mounted on the wall, with the main breaker and rows of smaller breakers inside. An old system. No backup power. She placed her hand on the main breaker. She thought of Benji. Her son was at daycare, safe, knowing nothing. She thought about how, if she pulled the breaker, the whole warehouse would go completely dark. And in the darkness, she would have an advantage over the men out front, because she knew the layout of this hallway. She had just walked through it, while they were still up front. She also thought that the video had already been sent, and if Nico was the man she thought he was, he would come. The only question was when. Tessa pulled the breaker. The warehouse sank into complete darkness. Shouts rang out from the front, the guards cursing, footsteps breaking into confusion. Tessa stood tight against the back hallway wall in the dark, silent, gripping the wrench. She didn't run. She waited. And she didn't have to wait long. From the warehouse's front entrance, flashlights swept through the darkness. Footsteps came fast, sharp, and familiar. Then a voice rang out in the dark. A voice she had heard often enough to recognize even without seeing his face. Cold, firm, and absolutely certain. Nico Valenti had just stepped into the warehouse. 20 minutes before Nico stepped into the warehouse, he was sitting in the restaurant office when Frankie opened the door without knocking. Frankie never opened the door without knocking, unless something serious had happened. He placed a phone on Nico's desk and pressed play. The video was 14 seconds long. Tessa sat on an iron chair inside an empty room, her face calm, her eyes looking straight into the camera. Beneath the video was a message. Come alone. Warehouse 7, West District. If you don't, she pays the price. Nico watched the video once. Then he watched it again. His face didn't change, but Frankie, who had stood beside Nico for 15 years, saw his fingers close against the surface of the desk. Slowly, firmly, the way a man gathers all his rage into one single point instead of letting it explode. A trap, Frankie said. Obviously a trap. Pharaoh wants you there alone so he can force negotiations, or worse. I know. Nico set the phone down. So what's the plan, boss? Nico stood. He took the watch off his wrist, removed the silver ring, and placed both in Frankie's hand. Frankie took them without a word, because he understood what that gesture meant. Call Marsh and Tommy, only those 2. Don't bring the whole crew. I don't want to turn this into a war. Then Nico picked up his phone and called another number. The call was brief, less than 2 minutes. On the other end was the Valenti family's private attorney. Nico spoke clearly, cleanly, without repeating himself. All the evidence of Carmine Farrow's operations that Nico had gathered over the years, financial documents, recordings, photographs, witnesses, would be sent to the FBI through an anonymous cooperation arrangement. The attorney would activate the file package immediately. If Nico didn't call back within 30 minutes to confirm he was safe, the attorney would notify the FBI that there was an emergency situation at Warehouse 7 in the West District, and the FBI would move in. Nico knew that by opening the door to the FBI, he was also placing himself under a microscope. This wasn't a move without a cost. But Tessa was inside that warehouse, and Nico had made his decision the moment he finished watching the video. 15 minutes later, 2 black cars stopped about 200 meters from Warehouse 7. Nico, Frankie, Marsh, and Tommy. 4 men. Nico stepped out first and walked straight toward the warehouse door. Frankie followed close behind. Marsh and Tommy spread out to both sides, covering the side entrances. The warehouse door opened. Inside, Carmine Farrow stood in the middle of the wide, empty space, both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. 4 men stood behind him. Farrow looked relaxed, the kind of relaxed a man wears when he thinks he has control. He watched Nico come in, then looked at Frankie behind him, and curled his mouth. I said come alone, Valenti, and I said you should let her go. Nico stopped about 5 steps from Farrow. But it seems neither of us is very good at following orders. Farrow gave a cold little laugh. Your mechanic is fine. I don't touch women, you know that. I just want to talk. About the Eastern Territory. About the 3% you took from me that night. He tilted his head. The great Nico Valenti, the man all of Ashford City has to look up to, letting a woman who fixes cars become his one weak spot. I have to say, I'm a little disappointed. Nico didn't answer right away. He stepped forward. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps. Close enough that Pharaoh had to lift his head to look up, because Nico was half a head taller than him. Close enough that the 2 men behind Pharaoh moved forward at the same time, but Pharaoh raised a hand, signaling them to stop, because backing away in front of Nico meant losing face. And in this world, Pharaoh knew the price of that. Nico spoke, his voice low, only loud enough for Pharaoh to hear. You can touch my money, touch my shipments, touch my territory. I'll take them back. If not today, then tomorrow. But you just touch something, I'm willing to destroy everything you've built to get back. Everything. Nothing left standing. Pharaoh looked into Nico's eyes, and in 20 years as boss of the West Side, in 20 years of negotiations, lies, and pressure, Pharaoh had looked into many men's eyes. He knew the difference between a threat and a promise. A man making threats had shifting eyes, a raised voice, a tense body. A man making a promise had still eyes, an even voice, and a calm so complete it became frightening. Nico Valenti was making a promise, and Pharaoh, for the first time in a very long time, felt something he had forgotten the shape of. Fear. Not fear of violence. Pharaoh was used to violence. It was fear of the absolute certainty in the eyes of the man across from him, the certainty of someone who had already made his decision and was only announcing it. Just then, Pharaoh's phone rang. He took it out and looked at the screen. His attorney was calling. Pharaoh answered, and his face changed second by second, from confidence to suspicion, from suspicion to understanding, from understanding to pale shock. The FBI had obtained search warrants for every business site and warehouse belonging to the Pharaoh family. The warrants were effective immediately. Pharaoh hung up and looked at Nico, and he understood that Nico had anticipated everything. The video, the meeting, the trap, all of it had been in Nico's hands before Pharaoh ever set foot inside this warehouse. You have 10 minutes to leave, Nico said. After that, I don't call back to confirm, and the federal agents come here. I think you should use those 10 minutes wisely. Pharaoh stood still for 3 seconds. Then he signaled for his men to withdraw. Not another word. He turned and walked out through the rear door, his men following behind him. The warehouse was empty, but the warehouse was still pitch black. Nico looked around. The lights weren't on. Frankie switched on his flashlight and swept it along the back hallway. Marsh checked the room where Tessa had been held. The iron door had been pulled off its hinges, hanging open. No one was inside. Boss. Frankie pointed his flashlight toward the end of the hallway. Tessa stood there, beside the warehouse's main electrical panel, her hand still resting on the breaker she had pulled. Her tool backpack was slung over her shoulder. Her face was pale, her lips dry, but her eyes were clear, completely clear. The eyes of someone who had never sat still waiting for anyone to rescue her, but had found her own way out and created an advantage with the only thing she knew, understanding how machines and systems worked. Nico looked at the iron door she had taken off its hinges with a wrench, looked at the electrical panel she had shut down, looked at Tessa standing there, alone, in the dark, with her father's old tool set, and he understood. She hadn't sat there waiting for him. She had found her own way out, cut the power to the whole warehouse to create confusion, and made an opening for herself before he even arrived. He had come to save her, but by the time he walked in, she had already saved herself. The first thing Tessa said, her voice hoarse, wasn't "thank you," wasn't "you came," but "where's Benji?" Safe, at daycare, someone's watching him. Tessa nodded. A slow, heavy nod, the kind that belonged to someone who had just had the largest stone lifted from her chest. Then her legs, the same legs that had kept her standing for hours inside that warehouse, in the dark, in fear she had refused to show, gave way beneath her. Nico stepped forward and caught her before she hit the floor. Tessa gripped his shirt, both hands clutching the fabric as if it were the only thing still keeping her upright, and she trembled. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only trembled, her whole body shaking, the way a person shakes after being strong for too long, and finally allowing herself to be weak in the arms of someone she knew wouldn't let go. Nico held her. He said nothing. He didn't say, "It'll be okay." He didn't say, "I'm here." He only held her, both arms firm around her, letting her tremble until the trembling passed. And in the dark warehouse, among the smell of dust and rusted iron, the two of them stood that way, silent, while Frankie stood outside the door, turned his back, kept watch, and pretended he hadn't seen anything. Right after the night at the warehouse, Nico ordered Frankie to review the entire internal system, who had given information to Pharaoh, who had told Pharaoh about Tessa, about her schedule, about her habit of taking mobile repair calls. It took Frankie less than a day. The garage cameras had recorded Polly making 3 phone calls during the week before the warehouse incident. Each time, he had gone to a blind corner outside in the parking lot. Each time, he had turned his back to the camera, but not hidden himself well enough for Frankie not to recognize him. When matched against the call logs Frankie managed to extract, all 3 calls had gone to a number belonging to one of Pharaoh's men, Polly, the lead mechanic. 5 years in the garage, the man who had watched Tessa repair the Porsche on her first day and had stayed silent from then on. The man who had seen her work every day, knew she had a little boy, knew she lived behind the garage, and still sold her information to Pharaoh for money. Nico met Polly in the private room behind the garage, the same room where he had sat across from Donnie a few weeks before, but this time was different. Donnie had betrayed him because of stupidity and debt. Polly had betrayed him by choice. He knew what he was doing. He knew the consequences, and he still did it. Polly sat across from Nico, his face gray. He said nothing, didn't deny it, didn't apologize. He knew denying anything was useless in front of Nico Valenti. Nico looked at Polly, silent for a long while. Then he spoke, his voice not angry, not cold, only the voice of a man telling a truth the man across from him had to hear. "You knew she had a little boy, 4 years old. You watched that boy run through the garage every afternoon. You knew she was a single mother, with no one but him, and you still sold her?" Polly lowered his head. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, but no sound came out, because there was nothing he could say in that moment that wouldn't make everything worse. "Get out," Nico said. "Leave the city. Don't ever show your face here again." Polly looked up, surprise flashing through his eyes, the kind of surprise a man has when he has prepared himself for the worst and receives something less than the worst instead. He stood, walked to the door. No thank you. No looking back. Frankie stood in the hallway, watched Polly leave, then looked at Nico. The old boss wouldn't have let him walk away that easily. Nico didn't answer. He knew Frankie was right. The old boss wouldn't have shown mercy. But the old boss had never sat in a hospital plastic chair at 3 o'clock in the morning while a 4-year-old child held his hand and said, "Stay here with me, okay?" The old boss had never had a reason to change. Pharaoh was indicted by the FBI 3 days later. Every business site, warehouse, and account was frozen and searched. The West Side Empire collapsed faster than Nico had expected, but Pharaoh, before the net closed around him, before the FBI knocked on his door at dawn on the 4th day, still managed to do one final thing. Not a strategic move, not a calculated plan, just the desperate act of a drowning man who wanted to drag down anything he could. Pharaoh sent one last man who hadn't yet been picked off to slip into Nico's garage late at night, find the 1967 Mustang, open the hood, and cut the brake line. Not cut it all the way through, only almost through. Enough for the brake fluid to leak slowly. Enough for the brakes to still work at low speed inside the garage but fail completely at high speed on the road. A final act of revenge. And he chose to take that revenge through the very car Tessa had spent 2 weeks staying up every night to repair. The car that held the last memory of Nico's father. The car she had brought back to life with old tools and a love she never said aloud. Pharaoh didn't choose that car by accident. He chose it because he knew it mattered. And he wanted to destroy something that mattered. The next evening, Nico drove the Mustang to the garage. He had started driving it more often since Tessa finished repairing it, as a way of living again with something he had believed was lost. He pulled into the bay, turned off the engine, and stepped out. Tessa was in the next bay, putting away her tools at the end of the day. She heard the Mustang come into the garage, heard the familiar engine sound she had listened to hundreds of times during those 2 weeks of repairs. But tonight, something was different. A small hiss, very small, hidden beneath the engine noise. Something an ordinary person would never have heard. But Tessa wasn't ordinary. Her ears had been trained since she was 8 years old to hear where a car was hurting, And that hiss shouldn't have been there in a car she had repaired perfectly 2 weeks earlier. She stepped over to the Mustang, opened the hood, and shone her flashlight inside. Her eyes swept over the system she knew by heart in every detail, and she saw it immediately. The brake line. Cut. Not split from wear, not damaged by time. A sharp, clean, deliberate cut. The brake fluid had nearly drained out. If Nico drove the car onto the road at high speed and stepped on the brakes, nothing would happen. Nothing except momentum and whatever stood in front of him. Tessa ran into the back room of the garage, where Nico was sitting with paperwork. She opened the door without knocking, exactly the way Frankie did when something serious had happened. "Did you drive here in the Mustang?" Nico looked up. "Yes. The brake line's been cut. Cut deliberately. The brake fluid's almost gone. If you had taken the highway tonight instead of coming back to the garage..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Nico stood. His eyes changed in an instant, from calm to razor cold, the kind of cold Tessa had seen the night he faced Pharaoh in the warehouse. He took out his phone and called Frankie. "Check the garage cameras from last night. Every angle. Find anyone who got near the Mustang." He hung up. Then Nico stopped. He looked at Tessa. She stood in the doorway, still breathing fast, her eyes still sharp. And he realized that if she hadn't had the ears of a mechanic forged since childhood, if she hadn't heard the hiss no one else would have heard, if she hadn't opened the hood to check by instinct, then tonight, or tomorrow, or any time he drove the Mustang onto the highway, he wouldn't have come back. "You hadn't checked," Nico said, his voice low. Tessa looked at him. "Then you wouldn't be sitting here talking to me." Silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Not heavy silence. But the silence of two people staring into a moment they both understood, where the line between still here and gone was so thin that one small hiss in an engine was enough. Nico nodded. A slow, heavy nod, the kind Tessa had seen him give when facing Donnie, Craig, and Pharaoh. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't a nod of command or agreement. It was the nod of a man whose life had just been saved by the very woman he had saved, and he knew that from this moment on, the debt between them was no longer a debt, but something else. Something neither of them was ready to name. The homeless woman with her father's old tool set. The woman who 3 months ago had still been sleeping in a van in the industrial district, had just saved the life of the most powerful crime boss in Ashford City. Not with money, not with power, but with ears that knew how to listen to where a car hurt. The thing her father had taught her when she was still so little she had to stand on tiptoe just to see over the hood. News in this world spread faster than fire. The story of Pharaoh being indicted by the FBI, the warehouse, the woman mechanic in Nico's garage, all of it reached Gianna Valenti's ears in less than 2 days. Gianna didn't call her son. She didn't need to ask Nico to know what was happening. She had her own ways of knowing everything, and she always had. Instead, she came to the garage on a Tuesday morning, driving her own car, without warning, without bringing anyone with her. Tessa was repairing the steering system of a sedan when she heard the sound of heels on the concrete floor. Not the sneakers of the mechanics, not the leather shoes of Nico or Frankie. High heels, steady rhythm, certain, the footsteps of a woman used to every door opening when she arrived. Tessa slid out from under the car, lifted her head, and saw a woman of about 60 standing in the middle of the garage. Her silver hair was pinned neatly back, her long coat was gray, and she wore no jewelry except a simple wedding ring on her ring finger. Her face was sharp, beautiful in the way of someone who had endured much without collapsing, and her eyes studied Tessa with the calm of a person who had spent a lifetime judging people. "You're Tessa Whitfield." It wasn't a question, it was confirmation. "Who are you?" Tessa stood, wiping her hands on a towel. "Gianna Valenti, Nico's mother." Tessa said nothing. She stood straight, looked at the woman, and waited. Gianna looked around the garage, at the luxury cars, at the old tool set on Tessa's workbench, at the oil-stained clothes Tessa was wearing. Then she looked back at Tessa and spoke, her voice polite, gentle, but every word carrying the weight of steel. "You know who my son is. You know what this family is. You know how this world works, because you've already witnessed it. The warehouse, Pharaoh, all of it. And you know, you aren't what this family needs." Tessa heard every word. She didn't step back. She didn't lower her head. She didn't look down. She had faced Craig when he threatened to take her child, had stood in the dark warehouse while Pharaoh's men held her, had looked straight into Nico Valenti's eyes once she knew who he was. She would not bow her head before another woman, even if that woman was the mother of the boss of Ashford City. "I didn't ask to be here," Tessa said, her voice even, not challenging, but not yielding either. "I work, I take my pay, I fix cars. That's all I do here. And whatever exists between me and your son, if anything does, is between him and me." Gianna looked at Tessa, silent. She looked for a long time, the way a woman looks when she is reconsidering her first judgment. She looked at Tessa's calloused hands, at the way she stood straight even with motor oil still on her skin, at those unblinking eyes, and perhaps she saw something she hadn't expected, something she had thought had vanished long ago from the women around this family, self-respect that didn't need money or power to hold it upright. Gianna turned and walked toward the garage door. Her heels struck the concrete floor in an even rhythm, but when she reached the door, she stopped. She didn't turn fully back, only tilted her head to one side, enough for Tessa to hear. "My husband was a mechanic once too, before he became Valenti." Then she walked out, got into her car, and left. Nothing more. Tessa stood alone in the garage. Her hands trembled slightly, now that Gianna was gone, and she finally allowed herself to tremble, but her back remained straight. She thought about Gianna's final sentence, about the husband who had once been a mechanic, about the road from beneath a car to the top of an underground empire, and she wondered whether Gianna had been warning her or telling her something else, something the woman couldn't say directly because she was Gianna Valenti. And Gianna Valenti never said anything directly when she could let someone else understand it on their own. But that night, as Tessa lay in the room behind the garage, listening to Benji's steady breathing beside her, she no longer thought about Gianna. She thought about everything. Craig, Pharaoh, Polly, the dark warehouse, the cut brake line, and she realized one thing with painful clarity, so clearly she couldn't pretend not to see it. Beside Nico, she and Benji would always be targets. Not because Nico wanted it that way, but because his world didn't allow anyone peace. She had been held in a warehouse because of him. The car she repaired had been sabotaged because of him. Craig had come back partly because he had smelled money around him. Every danger she had faced in the past 3 months had one source, Nico. And if she stayed, there would be more names after Pharaoh, more nights in dark warehouses, more cut brake lines. And next time, Benji might not be at daycare. Next time, her son might be there. The next morning, Tessa waited for Nico at the garage door. She had packed everything the night before. Her backpack on her shoulder, Benji standing beside her, his hand holding hers. "You saved my son. You saved me. I'll be grateful to you for the rest of my life, and I mean that." Tessa looked at Nico, her eyes without tears, only the clarity of a woman who had already decided. "But I can't let Benji grow up in this world. I can't let my son become the target of the next person who wants leverage over you." Nico looked at her, looked at Benji standing beside her, holding his mother's hand, his eyes lifted toward the 2 adults without understanding what was happening. Nico didn't say, "Stay." He didn't say, "I'll protect you." He didn't say any promise he knew his world could break at any moment. He only nodded. A slow, heavy nod. The kind of nod a man gives when he is letting something go even though he doesn't want to. Tessa led Benji away. She didn't look back, not because she didn't want to, but because she was afraid that if she did, she wouldn't have the strength to keep walking. That night, Tessa and Benji stayed in a small room rented by the week on the south side of the city. The walls were damp, the paint was peeling, and the window looked out onto a narrow alley. But there was a bed, there were blankets, there was a lock on the door. Benji lay on the bed, hugging the wooden car his grandfather had made, sleeping deeply. At least tonight, her son had a bed, not a car seat. Tessa sat on the floor, her back against the wall, watching her son sleep. She didn't cry. She had forgotten how to cry a long time ago. Or perhaps she had cried enough during those 2 years in the van that tears were no longer a reflex. She sat still for a while, then stood, took a piece of paper and a pen from her backpack. She began to write. Room rent each week, $175. Food for the 2 of them, about $40 a week if she cooked everything herself. Daycare for Benji, $200 a month if she found a cheap place. Altogether, each month, she needed at least $1,200. Mobile car repairs, on average, brought in $50 to $80 each job, which meant she needed at least 15 to 20 customers a month, 4 to 5 customers a week. Possible, if she called the old shops again, if she took extra evening jobs, If she didn't get sick. If Benji didn't get sick. If the van kept running. Too many ifs. But Tessa had lived on ifs for 2 years. She knew how to turn if into done. She folded the paper, put it into her bag, turned off the light, and climbed onto the bed beside Benji. She pulled her son into her arms, her nose touching his hair, and closed her eyes, because that was the only thing Tessa knew how to do when the world collapsed. Stand up, calculate, and keep going. Nico didn't look for Tessa. On the first day after she left, Frankie asked whether he needed to send someone to watch where she was. Nico shook his head. On the second day, Frankie asked whether he wanted to call her. Nico shook his head. On the third day, Frankie didn't ask anymore, but by the fourth day, he couldn't hold back. I don't understand. Boss put everything on the line to protect her. Handled Craig. Faced Pharaoh. Almost lost his life because of the Mustang. Then she left, and Boss does nothing? Nico sat in the restaurant office and looked at Frankie. Because she's right. Frankie went silent. He wanted to argue, wanted to say that the boss could protect her better than anything out there, that no one would dare touch someone who belonged to Nico Valenti. But he remembered the dark warehouse. He remembered the cut brake line. He remembered Craig standing in the middle of the garage, threatening to take her son. And he understood that Tessa wasn't wrong. Beside Nico, she and Benji would always be in someone's sights. If not today, then tomorrow. If not Pharaoh, then someone else. This world had no shortage of men who wanted to find Nico Valenti's weakness, and now everyone in it knew who that weakness was. Frankie nodded and turned away. Nico stayed sitting alone. 1 week passed, then 2 weeks. The garage still ran. A new mechanic had come in to replace Polly. Everything operated normally, but normal was only the surface. Underneath it, something had changed. Nico came to the garage less often. He didn't sit in the last bay anymore. He didn't walk past the Mustang. He didn't stop at the door of the back room where Tessa and Benji had once stayed. That room was empty now. The bed still made with clean sheets, but no one slept there. Sometimes, when Nico passed by, he thought he still heard the 4-year-old boy's voice echoing back, "Mommy." The bed's soft, and then realized it was only memory. One night, close to midnight, Nico sat inside the closed restaurant. All the lights were off. Only the glow from the streetlights outside slipped through the gaps in the curtains, drawing long streaks across the wooden floor. There was a glass of whiskey on the table. He had poured it at 10 o'clock, but had only taken 1 sip. He wasn't drinking because he wanted to get drunk. He was sitting there because this was where he needed to sit, in order to see clearly the thing he had tried not to see for 10 years. Frankie walked in. He saw the boss sitting in the dark, no lights on, the glass of whiskey still nearly full, and he knew tonight was one of those nights when the boss needed someone beside him more than he needed someone to take orders. Frankie pulled out a chair and sat across from him without speaking. Nico looked at the restaurant floor. The wooden floor had been replaced long ago, but he still remembered the exact spot. The right corner, beside the third column, between table number 4 and table number 5. He remembered because he had been standing there, 23 years old, when his father fell. "My father went down right here on this restaurant floor," Nico said, his voice flat, without emotion. But Frankie knew it was because he was using all his strength to keep it from breaking. That night, I was 23. I ran to him, held him, but I wasn't in time. He looked at me, his mouth open, trying to say something, but he couldn't get the words out. Then his eyes closed. Right here on this restaurant floor, right where I'm sitting. Frankie sat still. He knew this story. He had heard pieces of it from the old people in the family, but he had never heard Nico tell it. Never. 15 years, and this was the first time. "I swore that night," Nico continued, "that no one in the family would go out like that again. No one. And I kept my word. 10 years. No one in the Valenti house was touched. 10 years. He stopped. But the price was that I had to become more frightening than everyone else. I had to be the name no one dared say out loud. I had to be the man who walked into a room and made the whole room stop breathing. I kept the family safe by turning myself into something everyone feared." He looked at the whiskey glass. "And I thought that was enough. I thought keeping people alive was enough. Until..." He didn't finish. But Frankie knew what he was thinking of. The 4-year-old child holding his hand on a hospital bed near dawn. "Stay here with me, okay?" 5 words that 10 years of power couldn't buy. That child took my hand and said, "Stay here with me," Nico said, his voice lower. And I thought, if I go out like my father, if one day I fall on this restaurant floor just like he did, what will that boy remember about me? Will he remember a boss the whole city feared? Or will he remember the man who sat beside him in the hospital for one night and then vanished? He set the whiskey glass down. I don't want to become that kind of memory. Frankie looked at his boss. In 15 years, he had seen Nico make every kind of decision. $1,000,000 decisions. Life and death decisions. Decisions that shifted the balance of power across the entire city. But he had never seen Nico make a decision from this place. From the deepest place. The place the boss had hidden for 10 years beneath his coldness and control. The following week, Nico began. He met with lawyers, accountants, and every contact inside the organization. He sold off the gray operations, the pieces the Valenti family had been running since before his father's time. He kept what was legal, the restaurant chain, the garage, the real estate with clean paperwork. Dirty money was cleaned through the legal system. Assets were transferred. Contracts were rewritten and signed again. It wasn't the work of one day. It wasn't the work of 1 week. But Nico began. And when Nico Valenti began something, he didn't stop. Pharaoh was formally indicted. The West Side Empire collapsed completely. Ashford City grew quieter, at least on the west side. And the Valenti family, for the first time in 3 generations, began stepping out of the dark. Nico met Gianna, in the restaurant, in the middle of the day, at a table by the window, sunlight pouring in. Not a meeting in the dark, not a family-style meeting. Just a son talking to his mother. "I won't live like father," Nico said. "I won't go out like father." Gianna looked at her son. She stayed silent for a long time. In her eyes was something Nico rarely saw. Not tears. Gianna Valenti didn't cry in front of anyone. But exhaustion. The deep exhaustion of a woman who had lost her husband to this world, and had lived for 30 years with the fear that she would lose her son the same way. She didn't object. She didn't say, "You're right," or "You're wrong." She only placed her hand over Nico's, held it lightly, then let go. That was all she needed to say. A month had passed since the day Tessa left the garage. A month in which Nico didn't look for her, didn't call, didn't send anyone to follow her. One afternoon, while he and Frankie sat in the restaurant office reviewing transfer contracts, Frankie asked one final question. "Boss is doing all of this because of her?" Nico looked up. "I'm doing it because of me. Because I want to be worthy." He paused. "She only gave me the reason to begin." Frankie nodded. And for the first time, in his own mind, he didn't call Nico boss. He called him by his name. 1 month. Nico Valenti changed. Not because Tessa would come back. Maybe she never would. But he changed because he didn't want to fall on this restaurant floor like his father. And if one day that 4-year-old child remembered him, he wanted the boy to remember someone who dared to stop, not someone who kept running until he collapsed. Nico came to Tessa's rooming house on a Saturday afternoon. Alone. No Frankie. No bodyguards. No black car. He drove the Mustang, parked in front of the cheap row of weekly rooms on the south side of the city, and stepped out in a casual shirt, no suit, no watch, looking like any man coming to visit someone on the weekend. He stood in front of room number 12, on the 2nd floor, where the outside concrete staircase had several chipped steps. He knocked. Tessa opened the door. She was wearing an old shirt, her hair tied up high, her hands still marked with motor oil, as if she had just finished fixing something in the room or had just come home from work. She saw Nico and went still, not because she was afraid, not because she was angry, but because she had spent the past month trying not to think about this man, and now he was standing at the door of her rented room, alone, and she realized she had failed at not thinking about him from the very first day. "I didn't come to ask you to come back," Nico said at once, before she could close the door, invite him in, or say anything at all. He said it first because he knew it would be the first thing she thought, and he wanted to move it out of the way before saying what he had really come to say. Tessa looked at him, looked at the Mustang parked down on the street, looked back at him, then she stepped aside and opened the door wider. Not exactly an invitation, only not blocking him. Nico walked in. The room was small. 1 bed, 1 table, 1 chair, 1 mini refrigerator. Benji wasn't there, probably at daycare or with the neighborhood woman Tessa trusted. On the table were several sheets of paper covered in numbers, The ink marks faded from being written over and over, the kind of notes made by someone who calculated money every single day. Nico looked at those papers for 1 second, then turned to Tessa. He placed a thin folder on the table. There's a small storefront downtown, near the corner of 5th and Henderson. The landlord is someone I know. He's renting it out at a reasonable price. He opened the folder. Inside were the storefront details, square footage, rent, location, and another sheet of paper. A business registration form, most of the information already filled in. On the line for business name, 4 words were printed clearly. Walt's Garage. Tessa looked at the paper. Her eyes stopped on that name. Walt's Garage. Her father's name. The name of the man who had taught her to hold a wrench when she was 8 years old, who had taught her to listen for where a car hurt, who had left her the old tool set that Craig hadn't bothered to take because he thought it was worthless. The name of the man she carried in every repair she made, in every part she removed and put back, in every time she lay beneath a car and thought, "Dad, this one hurts here." That name, on a business registration form, and her hand trembled. "I'm not paying the rent for you," Nico said, his voice calm. "The rent is yours to handle. I only introduced you to the landlord. You have the skill, you have customers, and you'll build it yourself. I'm only opening the door. Whether you walk through it or not is your decision." Tessa was still looking at the paper. She didn't lift her head. "Why?" she asked, her voice low. "Because your father taught you to fix cars so you could have a future. Not so you could take mobile repair jobs day by day out of a van until you couldn't do it anymore. You deserve a place where you can put his name on the sign." Nico stopped. "And because this has nothing to do with what I want. This is something you should have had a long time ago." Tessa looked up. Her eyes were red, but no tears fell. She looked at Nico, and she saw that he was different. Not different because of his clothes, or because Frankie wasn't beside him. Different in his eyes. They weren't as cold as before. They weren't controlling every millimeter of expression. There was something softer there. Not weakness, but the letting go of a man who had stopped trying to hide everything. "Pharaoh is in prison," Nico continued. "The West Side Empire is gone. The Valenti family is only restaurants and the garage now. Legal. I sold off everything else. I won't promise I'm completely clean, because 10 years can't be erased in 1 month, but I'm moving in the right direction, and I won't stop." Tessa listened. She didn't interrupt. She let him speak, because she knew what he was saying wasn't easy, and he wasn't saying it to persuade her. He was saying it because he needed her to know. "You asked me a question before you left," Nico said, his voice lower. "You asked whether your son would be safe. I didn't answer then, because I didn't dare lie to you." He looked straight into Tessa's eyes. "Today I came back because the answer is different." Silence. The small rented room, the afternoon sunlight slipping through the window, drawing a long stripe of light across the old tile floor. Tessa stood beside the table, her hand still resting on the paper that carried her father's name. Nico stood opposite her, both hands at his sides, not stepping closer, not stepping back. He had said everything. He had placed it all on the table. Not money, not power, but change, reason, and a door. He had opened the door. Whether she walked through it was up to her. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Nico was about to turn and leave, because he didn't want to stand there long enough to become pressure. He had learned something in the past month, that loving someone sometimes meant letting them decide for themselves, even if that decision didn't include you. But before he could turn, Tessa spoke. "The Mustang," she said, her voice soft, but every word clear. "The clutch needs replacing. Bring it to my new shop." Nico stopped. He looked at Tessa. She looked back at him, and in her eyes, he didn't see surrender, didn't see compromise, didn't see a woman giving in because she was lonely or because she needed money. He saw a choice, a clear, conscious choice made by a woman who had gotten back on her feet enough times to know when she should stand alone and when she should allow someone to stand beside her. Bring the Mustang to the shop wasn't really about the car. It was Tessa's way of saying, "I'm letting you into my life," in the only language they both understood, the language of motor oil, wrenches, and cars that needed fixing. Nico smiled, not a polite smile, not a controlled smile, not the smile the Valenti boss used in negotiations or with guests. A real smile, sudden, breaking out before he could stop it. The kind of smile Tessa had never seen on his face in all the past few months. It made his eyes narrow, brought small lines to the corners, made him look 10 years younger and more like an ordinary man than she had ever seen him. "Monday okay?" he asked. Tessa looked at that smile, and for the first time in a very long time, she smiled back. "Monday's okay." The sign went up on a bright Monday morning. 4 white painted words on a deep blue background, Walt's Garage, mounted right above the main entrance of a compact storefront at the corner of 5th and Henderson in downtown Ashford City. Tessa stood on the sidewalk, tilted her head up, and looked at her father's name on that sign, and she stood there for a very long time without saying a word, only looking. She had paid the first month's rent with the money she had saved from her garage wages and the mobile repair jobs she had taken all through the past month. No one had paid it for her. No one had handed it to her. She had stepped through that door on her own 2 feet, exactly the way her father had opened his first garage in the suburbs 30 years earlier, with skill, with patience, and with the belief that any car could be fixed if you knew how to listen to where it hurt. The shop was small, only 2 service bays, a tiny customer waiting area with a few plastic chairs, and a corner in the back that Tessa had set up for Benji. In that corner sat a large plastic bin filled with bolts, screws, and nuts of every size. And every afternoon after daycare, Benji sat there cross-legged, solemnly sorting each bolt by size from smallest to largest, then dumping them all out, mixing them up, and starting over again. Exactly the way Tessa used to do in her father's garage when she was so little she had to stand on tiptoe just to see over the hood. She watched her son sorting bolts, and she saw her father in him, in the way Benji tilted his head to study each piece, in the focused seriousness of a child playing a game he didn't even know was teaching him something. Nico came to the shop for the first time on the 4th day after it opened. He drove the Mustang into the service bay, stepped out, and looked around. The shop was small but clean. The tools hung in careful order on the wall. Tessa had scrubbed the concrete floor until it shone. He sat in the waiting area, drank the coffee Tessa had made with an old coffee maker she'd bought from a second-hand store, and the two of them talked about the Mustang's clutch, about the strange sound he was hearing from the left rear wheel, about needing to change the transmission fluid. They talked about cars. Only cars. Like 2 ordinary people. Nico came back a second time the following week, then a third time. Then it became a habit. He would come, park, sit and drink coffee, sometimes help Tessa carry heavy parts, sometimes simply sit and watch her work. He didn't push. He didn't rush. He didn't ask the big questions. He built trust day by day, with his steady presence, with coffee, with short conversations about engines and gearboxes, by being there without asking for anything at all. One Saturday afternoon, about 3 weeks after the shop opened, Tessa was under a car repairing the exhaust system for a regular customer. Nico was sitting in the waiting area reading a newspaper. Benji was in the corner playing, finished sorting bolts, and was now looking around for something else to do. The boy stood up, ran out to the waiting area, carrying the wooden car his grandfather had made for him, the car Benji had held while sleeping every night in the van, in the room behind the garage, in the damp weekly rental room, the only thing the little boy had never let go of. Benji ran over to Nico, stopped, and looked up at him. Then he held out the wooden car, lifting it with both tiny hands to face level. "Uncle Nico, the wheel broke. Can you fix it?" Nico looked at the wooden car. One small wheel had come loose, almost ready to fall off. He looked over at Tessa. She had slid out from under the car without anyone noticing, and was now standing beside the service bay, watching the two of them. Her eyes met his, and she gave a small nod. A tiny, gentle nod. But Nico understood that it wasn't just permission to fix a toy car. It was permission for him to step into Benji's life. Into her life. To cross the line she had protected for months. Nico set the newspaper down. He sat on the concrete floor, legs stretched out, back resting against the chair leg. Benji sat down across from him and placed the wooden car between them. Nico picked it up, examined the loose wheel, then looked around for glue. Benji ran off to grab the small tube of glue from his mother's tool table, ran back, and handed it to Nico with both hands, wearing a look of total seriousness. Nico applied the glue, reattached the wheel, held it steady between 2 fingers, and waited for it to dry. Benji sat and watched, his eyes never leaving the car, his head tilted to one side, his round eyes full of the kind of trust only children have. The man who had once made all of Ashford City tremble, the man even the police didn't dare name aloud, was crouched on the concrete floor of a little repair shop, patiently gluing a toy wheel back on for a 4-year-old boy. The glue dried. Nico set the car down on the floor and rolled it forward to test it. All 4 wheels turned smoothly. Benji let out a little cry of delight, grabbed the car, and rolled it back and forth across the floor. Then he looked up at Nico, grinned from ear to ear, and said something he had no idea carried so much weight. "You're so good at this. You're just like Grandpa." Nico's hand stilled. He looked up at Tessa, and in his eyes, Tessa saw something she had never seen in this man before. Something that all the cold armor, all 10 years of power, all of the Valenti Empire couldn't hide. Not tears, but close. Close enough that Tessa had to look away for a second, just to give him the space he needed. Then she walked over, sat down on the concrete floor beside Nico, beside Benji. She took the smallest wrench from her pocket, her father's wrench, and tightened the wheel axle a little more securely. The 3 of them sat on the garage floor, 2 adults and 1 child, repairing a wooden toy car that a grandfather had once made by hand before he left this world. And Tessa knew the answer to the question she had carried through all these months, through all the sleepless nights, through all the times she had drawn a line and watched it blur. The answer wasn't in promises, wasn't in money, wasn't in power. It was here, on the concrete floor, in the little wooden car that had been repaired, in the eyes of the man looking at her son as if that child were the whole world. Some people find each other not in perfect places, but in the places where both of them are still broken. Real love isn't about being saved. It's about being respected enough to stand back up on your own. Sometimes, the person who seems the most dangerous is the only one willing to change his entire world just to become worthy of standing beside someone. And sometimes, the oil-stained hands of a girl who has nothing can heal a heart that an entire city believed no one could ever reach. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it so this message can reach more people. Tell us how this story made you feel in the comments below. We'd truly love to hear what's in your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the emotional stories we share every day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every single day. Thank you for listening all the way to the final moment. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.